Hello, friends. From this side, the kettle will boil much faster. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. The bangs. All of them? Their sounds. They awoke me. I bolted right up in my bed. Looking around, I found nothing out of the ordinary. My room was perfectly normal, all my things exactly where I had left them. The half-empty glass of water, still half-empty, the comic book I was reading still unfinished. But those sounds. I had heard enough of them to know what they were. Gunshots. I had a cousin that worked for the law. Forehead James had fired enough for me to recognize them at the drop of a hat. He was called that because he had a huge scar across his forehead which he had received in a supposed act of heroism. I stepped off my bed, still dazed and in confusion as to what was going on. We had recently moved to the suburbs of a small town, so there's always a risk of bandits raiding our neighborhood. I made my way downstairs, worried about Mom and Dad. The stairs creaked and groaned as if they were in pain as I made my way down. What I saw shocked me. Everything was in disarray. The furniture all was torn up and dishes all broken. I know I'm a heavy sleeper, but good heavens, this was just ridiculous. The wooden floor was lined with a river of blood leading outside. The nauseating smell of gunpowder filled my lungs as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Mom and Dad weren't in their room. I put on my jacket and as I made my way out I noticed something very bizarre. Tufts of grey fur all over the porch. I leaned in to examine it. They were covered in blood and some of them were parallel to the trail of blood leading away. I started to follow it. The more I looked around, the more events started to elude me. Everyone's front doors were wide ajar and it seemed similar scuffles had taken place all over the town. The fur and the occasional spots of blood were everywhere. If I were to describe to you what the situation reminded me of, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been to a festival or a carnival after it had ended? The town reeked of that similar feeling. As if a massive event had just transpired and I was only an observer of its aftermath. The thought of how I could have mindlessly slept through the entire thing bugged me incessantly. Still oblivious, I noticed something on the ground a few feet ahead of me. It was very tiny. I approached the object as it glistened under the moonlit night, which is why it caught my eye in the first place. I learned to pick it up and immediately dropped it. It was extremely hot to the touch and had burned my fingers somewhat. Some sort of shining piece of metal. It seemed as if it had broken off of something. As I was about to inspect it closely, I heard a blood-curdling howl. It sends a wave of shivers down my spine. I had never heard anything like it before. The sound was accompanied by another ear-splitting bang. Instinctively I ran towards the sound. As young as I was never the one to cower, and in this situation, all I could think of were Mom and Dad. Their safety. The thought of harm befalling them was something I was trying to completely avoid. It was an exaggerated feeling of the same feeling you get when you were really young and your parents were out for a long time and your mind wanders off to the realm of what if something happened to them. It was something I chose not to think about. It took me a while to realize where I was headed. Towards the woods outside the area. Now in the woods, I was really far from home. It didn't bother me as much as it should have bothered a child my age, as I'd been very good at not getting lost. I was always good with directions. Making my way through the forest, I couldn't shake off an eerie sense of terror from my back. And soon enough that feeling solidified itself into one of true horror. The smell of gunpowder was replaced by a horrid stench even stronger than it. I looked towards it only for a pair of eyes to meet mine. The moment our eyes locked, I understood that whatever those eyes belonged to, was dead. And yes, you read it right. I said whatever. Because this was no human. The dead yet sharp eyes I was looking into were those of a fierce animal. Drool dripped down its muzzle. It was an enormous hound. No. Not a hound. A wolf. I had never seen one before in my life, but surely they couldn't have been this big. And what's stranger is that it was wearing tatters of what seemed to be clothed. It had brown boots on as well as other garments that were now ripped to shreds. Fear began to boil inside me, alongside the fluttering of butterflies in my stomach. I pushed on. And the more I worked my way forwards, the more I encountered dead bodies of these wolf-like creatures, massacred and sprawled all throughout the woods. I figured they must have been the townsfolk. Some places, I even thought I recognized some people. Had I been living in a town filled with them? What was this? Where were my parents? What was going on? Thoughts like these kept striking me over and over again until I came upon another body, and all the thoughts silenced. Everything went quiet. Even if I didn't recognize him by his facial features, I would recognize that huge scar anywhere. That scar that horizontally slashed his forehead. It was my cousin, Forehead James. My knees buckled as I started to tremble, all sense flying away from the world. Streams of tears made their way down my cheeks, tears that I didn't even know were there. I managed to mumble, "James," before breaking out into a cry. I nearly collapsed. Nearly. I had to know. Were my parents a victim of this? As little sense as it made for them to be monsters, they were still my parents. Before I moved on, I noticed something in James's scar. Something shiny and silver. I was too scared to get any closer though. I'd been walking for a while and was finally making my way out the other end of the woods. It was jarring to suddenly step out into the bright moonlight. Even so, I saw something in the distance. Two figures stood stark under the blazing moon. Two humans. Humans I knew. Mum and Dad. Subconsciously, a big smile streaked across my face as tears of utter joy flowed down like a river, and I called out to them in a big wave of relief. However, as they turned around, I saw that they were covered in blood. From head to toe. Blood and the same tufts of fur. But they weren't like those monsters. They were still themselves. They were. Dad suddenly pulled out something from behind. A gun. Unlike any I'd ever seen before. He cocked it and shot at me, point blank. I closed my eyes in a fit of panic and heard the same bang I'd been hearing all night. But nothing happened. As I opened my eyes, I noticed that Mum had deflected his arm upwards and the shot had pierced the sky. Dad looked at her, confused. She motioned towards me and said, "That jacket, oh God, Peter, no, please no." I checked my jacket, the one I'd always worn, to see what the problem was when my body froze. My hands, no, not hands. My hands, that were now paws, rested against my sides, with what looked to claw protruding from them. I looked on in dismay at the fur-covered limbs I now had as I reached to touch my face, only to find what was shaped like a muzzle, lined with sharp teeth. This can't be real. This has to be a nightmare. This has to be. My parents had walked all the way up to me and inspected mine closely. My mom was in tears, the tears mixing in with the blood and dirt on her kind face. She said my name, and I looked towards her and asked her what was happening. That only made her crying worse. My dad put a hand on my shoulders as he consoled my mom. All of us collapsed there, not knowing what to do. Even in all this madness, I felt safe. At this age, No matter what the circumstances, you always feel safe with your parents. After what seemed like an eternity, my mom finally began to speak. She explained the whole situation to me. It turns out that my mum and dad were werewolf hunters. They'd been trained since childhood and were part of a big organization that undertook this mission. They'd kind of separated from it in recent years, albeit still undertaking jobs now and then as they believed it was their destined duty which they could never run away from. They had settled down and had me. Tonight was their biggest mission yet. To blend in and then take down an entire town of werewolves. My mom had put sleeping medicine in my water to make sure I would sleep throughout the entire endeavor. However, seems like my extraordinary sense had awoken me to the sounds of those gunshots. That was the one thing they hadn't accounted for. Their son is a werewolf. The very thing they swore to eradicate. "Honey, you're a werewolf," my mom told me. And with a heavy heart, they told me that I could no longer live with them. The organization would surely find out that I was a werewolf. I cried at this, as did they. But there was nothing either of us could do about it. It seemed none of them knew about any existing cures to my condition. I was sent to live with distant relatives and haven't seen my parents in years. I hope they haven't forgotten me, as I haven't forgotten them. As sad as it was, Mom left me with a single souvenir. A parting gift to remember her by. A silver bullet.